Welcome again to AWC in Conversation. In today's conversation, we're heading west, and shortly I'll introduce Chantelle Jackson. My name's Joey Clark. I'm an ecologist and science communicator based in Sydney, and I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on Gadigal country. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Chantelle. Chantelle, welcome to AWC in Conversation. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Joey. Thanks for having me.
So Chantelle, you're a wildlife ecologist based in Perth, but you've worked across many AW sanctuaries. How long have you been with AWC now?
I started with AWC in the Southwest in 2014, so about 6 years now.
Okay, and prior to that, you worked on infrastructure projects, so quite a shift. Do you want to talk about some of that experience of your work before joining AWC?
Yeah, sure. I took a bit of a convoluted route, I guess, to get to AWC, but yeah, immediately before I joined the AWC team, I was working as a fauna consultant on various gas pipeline projects around Australia, so in WA, southern Queensland, northeast and South Australia.
And what sort of work was that? Like the major construction projects, what was your role?
So a big part of my role was, obviously these are buried pipelines, so they dig a very deep, sometimes very quite wide trench in the ground, 2 to 3 meters deep, and then they lay the pipe in that, and so I'd have to go and check for animals in that trench line every morning, and pull them out and release them back into the wild.
And you've described it before as the world's biggest pitfall trap exercise, the holes are dug for you. What are some of the animals that you found while you were looking through the trenches?
Yeah, it was certainly a lot less work than the pitfall trapping that I do now, that's for sure. But I was fortunate enough to work on a project right after all those big rains came through Queensland in 2010-11. So I was working in southern Queensland all the way from Wallumbilla through to northeast and South Australia. And and it had all obviously flooded, and all the Channel country came alive, and the desert came alive as well in South Australia. So I saw heaps of small mammals, coultars, a bunch of dunarts, all these different mice, way too many long-haired rats for my liking. And yeah, a whole bunch of reptiles as well. That's a large Woma python I found in Queensland.
Really cool. And then what kind of drove your decision to shift from that kind of work as a fauna consultant and to apply for a job with AWC?
So it was exciting work. I got to see some really cool things. I got to work in some really cool areas. But I kind of wanted to move to working with an organisation where everyone was sort of moving towards the same goal. So just in conservation and protecting the landscape and the habitats and the animals and everything. So yeah, just working with a bunch of like-minded people was kind of where I was keen to head.
I can see we've had a bunch more people join. So for those of you who have just joined, thanks for being with us. If you have questions for me or Chantelle, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have technical problems, use the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Chantelle, you're based in Perth, but you work across a number of different sanctuaries. And they're quite different. They're quite diverse properties. Do you want to talk us through Paruna and Karakamia? And then we'll talk about some of the other sanctuaries where you work.
Yeah, so like you say, I'm in the Southwest team for a lot of my time with AWC, based in Perth. And yeah, so Karakamia is in the Perth Hills. It's about half an hour from where I am now in my house. And it was the first AWC sanctuary, and it's about 275 hectares. It's got a predator-proof, introduced predator-proof fence around it. And it's mainly sort of jarrah forest in there. And then Paruna is a beautiful sanctuary. It's on one side of the Avon Valley, so it's quite steep. You certainly get good calf muscles when you're doing work at Paruna. And it's jarrah and marri forest and wandoo and some really nice granite outcrops, and possibly the best view from an AWC homestead, I think, at Paruna there.
Nice. So they're relatively well-treed, sort of forested environments, and a little bit smaller, close to Perth. and then going up to Mt Gibson. So that's sort of in the wheat belt. What's that country like?
So that's got quite a variety of habitats. There's a lot of acacia shrubland there. There's also some really beautiful salmon gum and York gum woodlands in there. Some really nice outcrops as well on the property, and yeah, a lot of acacia and some sort of mixed habitats as well. It's quite diverse. It's at the junction between two regions, so there's a lot of variety there.
So I've got the map up just showing our southwest properties, but we'll also talk about Newhaven in Central Australia in a minute. One of the sanctuaries that you get to work on, which I think must be pretty exciting, is an island. So actually quite early in AWC's history, we purchased a whole island in Shark Bay called Bouree Island. It's the only island that AWC owns, and we've been able to implement our model of hands-on conservation, so removing all of the feral predators. Are all the feral herbivores also removed from Faure?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's no feral animals on the island.
So sat right within the Shark Bay World Heritage Area. It's a bit of a logistical challenge working on Faure. So what's involved if you're carrying out a survey there or trying to move equipment onto the island? What's that process like?
Well, yeah, like you say, it's an island, so it's only about, I think at the closest point, it's about 7 k's from the mainland, but that, you know, may as well be a lot longer because yeah, it's an island, so you've got to cross the ocean to get there. But it's about, we access it from Monkey Mia or Shark Bay, so it's about 10 hours drive from Perth, and then either about a 9-minute flight or an hour's boat ride over there.
So there's a runway, you can land a small plane. What's the infrastructure like? Is there any kind of operations base or research centre?
Yeah, so there's a rustic homestead. It's a really old homestead. It's kind of a shed with a few rooms and a kitchen. It's actually really nice. I love going to Faure, and the homestead is part of the charm of it. It's right at the south of the island, and some of the rooms, you wake up in the morning and you're looking out onto the amazing waters of Shark Bay that you're showing people there. So, and then there's a big shed and, you know, a whole bunch of tools and everything for all the land management and the science that goes on there as well. So most of the stuff stays on the island because, getting things on and off the island is just very difficult and very expensive.
This is a nice escape for those of us stuck in our pajamas at home. So just enjoy the view of Faure Island. Hopefully before too long we can start to travel around a little bit more. So Faure Island is feral predator free. In that case, it doesn't need a fence because it's got a big moat. What are some of the marine animals that you can see from Faure Island?
We recently actually did a trial flight for some shorebird monitoring there, and that was, I had to remind myself that I was meant to be looking at the shorebirds because it was a very nice marine animal flight. There was manta rays, there's a bunch of turtles, we've seen a dugong at the landing a few times, sea snakes, it's a bunch of fish, of course, as well. It's a very nice place to spend some time, for sure.
And then because it's feral predator free, we've been able to re-establish populations of some mammals which are extinct on the mainland. There are also some that survived on Faure Island, is that right? Or have they all been reintroduced?
So there's 4 mammal species that have been reintroduced to Faure Island. So there's the burrowing bettong, which is showing people now, the banded hair wallaby, the Shark Bay mouse, and the Shark Bay bandicoot. Some people might know that one as the western barred bandicoot. So they're the 4 mammal species, other than a bat, that live on the island.
And what are the populations like? You know, for burrowing bettongs, I've heard they're all over the place on the ground.
Yeah, there's heaps. Our estimates are in the thousands on the island, and that, I mean, Faure Island is about 5,000 hectares. So when you say thousands of bettongs there, it can lead to some skepticism, but there's heaps, honestly. There's so many around. I've been radio tracking on the island before and turned off my torch for a bit, and you just hear them all hopping in to look at you, and you turn your torch back on and you're surrounded by about 5 burrowing bettongs. Yeah, there's heaps around. And the banded hair wallabies are doing really well as well. Over the last few years, we've been seeing them a lot more incidentally around the place. Our monitoring survey tells us that they're all across the island, and yeah, so they're doing really well as well. It's very exciting.
I do have a picture of a banded hair wallaby. Just while I'm pulling that up, are there ever any problems from that abundance of bettongs? I seem to remember a story of a plane trying to land and you had to clear bettongs off the airstrip. Was that Faure Island?
Oh, might have been. That could have been before my. That could have been before my time. Yeah, they certainly. You need to close all the doors in the house at all times, because if you leave a door open, even for a very brief amount of time, the bettongs will move in and raid your stores. And getting more stores on the island is difficult because you need a plane or a boat to do so. So you don't want to feed the bettong, unintentionally feed the bettongs your pasture for that night.
So that's what happens when these animals are restored to habitat that's suitable, and when feral predators have been removed. The banded hair wallaby is a really unique species. It's the only member of a subfamily of the kangaroo group, which is very ancient. And they were actually extinct on the mainland. And that's quite a common story for these animals, isn't it?
Yeah, so all 4 of those species that are that we put back on Faure Island only lived on 2 other islands just a bit north of Faure, so Bouree and Bouree Island. A lot of the mammals actually that have gone regionally extinct from elsewhere have sort of contracted to the southwest, or yeah, these islands off the coast of WA, sort of, yeah, off the middle of WA there.
I've got just a map here which might be interesting for people, just showing that pattern of mammal declines. So you may have seen this in our presentations before, but it's interesting to look at how many mammals are missing from large areas of Australia. So on this map, it's basically showing the darker the patch, the more mammals have gone locally extinct. So in Central Australia, it's almost a dozen species which would have been there historically, which are now either completely extinct or locally extinct. Another hotspot is down in the southwest, and Mt Gibson is actually right within that band of high extinctions. It's really what motivates our reintroduction program. So across Australia, we're missing this huge chunk of our biodiversity. It's been described as a marsupial ghost town. But if you set out the right conditions and you can establish feral predator-free safe havens, we're able to start rebuilding that diversity of small mammals. But to do that, you have to create an area that's completely free of feral predators. And so AWC has been doing that by establishing a network of large fenced areas. You know, we're not lucky enough to have a network of islands, but these are essentially mainland islands. So the fence at Mt Gibson, Chantelle, do you want to talk through just the size of it and how many species have been re-established at Mt Gibson?
Yeah, sure. I've weirdly just drawn a blank on the size of it. I think it's about around 7,500. Sorry?
Just under
7,500.
Yeah.
Yeah, so actually when I started, the fence hadn't even been built. So in 2014, it had been cleared, but it was under construction. So yeah, it's a big, it's a huge fenced area. I think the fence line itself is 42 kilometres long or something. So it's, and then just, yeah, in my time with AWC, it's been really nice to see there's now, we've put 8 species back in that fenced area, and some of them are just, you know, you can guarantee to see them if you go out at night. You know, you see woylies. We often see banded hair wallabies. There's diggings all around the joint that you fall in. Bilbies. I saw my first numbat during the day the other day. Last year at Mt Gibson, which was super exciting. And yeah, so there's been 8 species put back in there, and they're doing well.
So that's actually more than any other reintroduction site. So nowhere else has seen 8 mammal species restored, certainly in Australia, and it might even be the record worldwide. So we're, you know, achieving great things at Mt Gibson. You mentioned the woylie, and this is another species of bettong. Brush-tailed bettong is their other name. And they're extremely rare. So they've only survived in the wild in a very small few pockets of southwestern WA. So we're now relying very heavily on these fenced sanctuaries to restore populations of this species. I just want to bring up the graph of their population at Mt Gibson. Do you want to talk through that, Chantelle? That I imagine you'd be pretty happy with the trend in population there.
Yeah, they're doing extremely well. I think the graph says it all, really. Yeah. So I meant to look up the numbers before this, but yeah, we put in, I think, around 100 woylies across a few years, and now the number's up around 1,000 animals, give or take a few. So they were the first species to go in 2015. So in 2019, just 4 years after, they're already in, you know, up around 1,000 animals. So that's really encouraging and really exciting. And like I say, you just see them around everywhere. They're becoming a problem when we're trying to monitor the other species on our cameras. You just get thousands of images of woylies on there.
That's pretty significant when you consider just how rare these species are. So, you know, for things like the burrowing bettong, completely extinct on the mainland, but it would have been super abundant. You know, some people predict there would have been tens of millions or hundreds of millions of burrowing bettongs on mainland Australia. It just speaks to how devastating cats and foxes have been preying on those small and medium-sized mammals. So it's really encouraging to see those populations bouncing back at Mt Gibson in the absence of feral predators. All right, now I'll just remind everyone that you can ask questions as we go. Use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If you have any technical problems, use the chat button. Just coming back to these burrowing mammals in particular, you know, people sometimes ask, why is it important? Like, you know, does it matter that we're missing a whole host of biodiversity? What effects does that have on the landscape?
Yeah, so when we're undertaking these reintroduction programs, it's not just about creating a safe population of those animals. It's also about trying to restore the landscape to what it used to be. So a lot of these animals, the woylie, the burrowing bettong, the bilby, they're furious digging species, and they turn over heaps and heaps of soil, and that soil turnover and the creation of, you know, pockets of I can't think of the word, like holes in the ground where things collect and everything, they alter the landscape. They call them ecosystem engineers. And there's a lot of research that goes into measuring how that changes, the landscape and the vegetation that grows and a whole variety of things.
What's the sort of monitoring that you do after a reintroduction? So, you know, Mt Gibson, for example, you've got 7,500 hectares, and you were saying you might have introduced 100 woylies over a series of releases. How do you go about making sure that their populations are, you know, or checking on how their populations are trending?
Yeah, so we don't just let 50 woylies go and assume they'll be fine. And as part of the translocation proposal that we seek input from a whole range of experts and recovery teams and governments on and everything, we have to say how we're going to propose to monitor them quite intensely immediately after the translocation, and then sort of on an annual basis in the longer term. What we propose to do sometimes doesn't work when you're putting these species back in a different area. Sometimes the monitoring techniques that work somewhere else don't work in this new area. But yeah, we do really intensive monitoring, and it can include a whole range of things. So radio tracking of animals, so putting collars or transmitters on them and tracking them on a daily basis, trapping them, nest box monitoring for some species like the red-tailed phascogale, scout plots, spotlighting or driving transects for numbats. Yeah, there's a whole host of monitoring techniques that we use to really closely monitor these populations after they're released.
You mentioned the red-tailed phascogale, and they're absolutely darling little marsupials. So these are related to things like antechinus and quolls, so carnivorous marsupials. I haven't prepared you for this question, Chantelle, but could you describe in some detail the breeding biology of the red-tailed phascogale, please?
Oh, yeah. So they've got quite a fixed breeding season for starters. They sort of breed for only 2 weeks in a year. And then the males of this species, during that 2 weeks, they focus all of their energy on making more phascogales to the detriment of eating and just maintaining basic life things. And at the end of that breeding season, all the males die, and then the females have the young, and the next generation comes along.
I saw the paper that first described this sort of breeding. I think it was in Antechinus, and it was called Big Bang hypothesis or something like, or Big Bang strategy. So they essentially shag themselves to death.
I wasn't quite going to put it like that, but you did, Joey, so thanks.
What happens? How does that affect plans when you're trying to plan a translocation for a species like this? Do you have to take that breeding cycle into account?
Yeah, absolutely. So the red-tailed phascogale, those animals came from, they're restricted now to the southwest of Western Australia. And when we move these species, we have to go down and we do pre-translocation monitoring. So we make sure there's enough animals in those remnants before we move them. And that, yeah, it has to be done at a certain time of year. We sort of do it in April, and then the translocation has to happen before their breeding season. Yeah, so it does influence, and that's the same with all the species. You've got to think about, for the species in particular that have got regular breeding cycles, you've got to think about that when you're moving them, because you don't want to move, well, males, I guess that would be in poor condition or when they're meant to be doing something else. But also you don't want to move female marsupials with really, really large pouch and that kind of stuff.
Over the last few months, you've been working on a project in Central Australia, and don't want to give too much away here, but it's to do with an animal that we've just been talking about, and a translocation into what is currently Australia's largest feral predator-free fenced area at Newhaven in Central Australia. AWC supporters will have heard us talk about this project. It's an absolutely enormous landscape scale project to restore the mammal fauna of Central Australia. I'll just show you a picture of the fence at Newhaven. So it is almost 9,500 hectares. So it eclipses our previous projects at Scotia and Mt Gibson. And it actually encompasses the entirety of that range on the left-hand side of the screen, Wardakin. Chantelle, you've got a real affinity for the arid zone. What is it that you really like about inland Australia?
You know, I don't like this question, Joey, because I find it hard to answer. There's a bunch of things I really like about the arid zone, I guess, in terms of the animals and the plants and everything. I think it's a land of extremes is one way you can put it. A lot of people would be familiar with the boom and bust cycles of the deserts, and I find it really cool that things persist out there. And there's actually a lot that persists out there. On the surface, a lot of people could look at it and just think it's a lot of red dirt and spinifex, but it's so rich in life, and I think that's really cool. And then another reason I love it, I can't explain. I just really enjoy being out in that area.
Well, we're really excited to be working on this latest project at Newhaven, restoring that species that we've just been talking about, red-tailed phascogale, and that's really imminent. I just wanted to give you a sense of the scale of that fenced area. So that stage 1 area, as I said, it's 9,500 hectares, which is, it can be a bit hard to get your head around. Stage 2, which we're in the process of planning at the moment, is proposed to expand that area up to at least 100,000 hectares. And if you overlay that area over Sydney, for those of you who are in Sydney and familiar with it, that's what the stage 2 area will look like. So it's an absolutely enormous project. Of course, we're working very closely with the Bouree Newhaven Rangers, and some of you will know Alice and Christine Henwood, who have made it possible for us to remove cats from this vast area. So Chantelle, this is a picture of you releasing one of these red-tailed phascogales. What's involved in preparing for a translocation of this kind of species? Because they're kind of arboreal, aren't they? How do you prepare the site where they're going to be released?
Yeah, so there's, like you say, they're arboreal and they're known to live in hollows. It's what that little guy is going into. But so you need to look at the availability of hollows in the release area to make sure they've got enough daytime houses. And if there's not enough, or if you think that there isn't going to be enough, we've put nest boxes up at Newhaven. So there's 42 nest boxes out there at the moment. And we put nest boxes up at Mt Gibson as well, just to provide them, homes if there's a low abundance of hollows out there, which wasn't the case at Mt Gibson. They actually didn't like our constructed houses for them. They preferred to live in their natural homes, which is totally fair enough.
Cool. Well, stay tuned, because over the next week or so, we're expecting to announce that this translocation at Newhaven has gone ahead. So you're getting a little bit of a sneak preview of what's coming up, but we'll keep you posted on how that's all going out at Newhaven. That just about brings us to the end of the conversation part, but we've still got plenty of time to address some of the questions that have come in. A question about the genetics of the populations that we're restoring. How do we make sure that we've got a healthy genetic mix in the founder populations for these species?
So there's a whole host of considerations when you're going to reintroduce the species to an area, and the genetic makeup of that population is one of those things you've got to consider. If there's genetic information that's known about the populations that that currently exist of that species, then you can look at that genetic information and work out, it's really hard to, I guess, simplify it, because it's quite complex, and we consult with some very good geneticists in this area to make these decisions. But basically, you want to make sure you've got a good mix going in, and you can either use known information or kind of best principles in terms of mixing animals. And then we also make a commitment to do some genetic monitoring about 5 to 10 years down the track, just to see if the genetics that we've put in currently exist in that population. So if the founding genetics are still represented. So
it's definitely taken into account selecting the animals for those initial releases. Another interesting question here, just about where we source animals from for these reintroduction projects. So we talked about Mt Gibson, where there's a really healthy population of some of those mammals. But for the red-tailed phascogales going to Newhaven, we've partnered very closely with Alice Springs Desert Park. What has their involvement been?
The Alice Springs Desert Park? So last year, in 2019, we went and did some a sourcing of animals from down in the southwest, the red-tailed phascogales, and 20 of those went to Mt Gibson and 21 went to Alice Springs Desert Park to set up a captive breeding program there. So the benefit of the captive breeding program is that you can, mix animals, I guess, in a more controlled manner, and it also lessens the impact on those limited source populations as well, and you can release a larger number of animals without taking all of those from the wild.
Okay, so we've actually got at least 50 questions here, so apologies if we don't get to yours, but we will try and address as many as we can in the time remaining. A question from Dean Haywood: do cats and foxes still manage to breach the fenced areas? Chantelle?
Well, no, they shouldn't. It's a very good design. So I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with it, but for those that aren't, it's got a floppy top that hangs over that stops things from climbing up, like they can't climb over around the floppy top. It's got some electric wires on the fence. It's about 2 meters high as well. And then it's got a skirt along the ground on both sides as well to stop things digging underneath. So it's extremely difficult to breach that fence, but also we do really closely monitor for incursion. So there's cameras and dragging and all sorts of stuff that goes on to make sure that just at a very, very, very slim outside chance, nothing is getting in.
I should have really addressed this one first, but the question on everyone's lips will be, how can I help this work? In the chat, we'll post a link to our donation page. So if you're inspired by the work that we're doing, restoring populations of native mammals back across our network of sanctuaries, please feel free to make a donation. Beyond donations, word of mouth is extremely valuable. So tell your friends. If you think anyone else that you know would be interested in these webinars, you can share the link with them and get them to sign up and register for next week's instalment. We also have a volunteer program, and if you're interested, you can sign up on the website for our, there's a special volunteer portal, and then we'll keep you updated when opportunities become available after all this COVID thing's finished. Okay, a question about tracking. So you've talked about radio tracking with some of the released animals. This question's from Andrew. How do you radio track tiny animals like a phascogale?
So tiny animals, technology's come a long way, I guess, in this space, and yeah, what you can fit into a really tiny transmitter now is a lot more than you could probably even a few years ago. But you can put collars on small animals. They've done a lot of it actually at North Head with some of their reintroductions there of the pygmy possums and the brown antechinus. So very tiny collars on very tiny animals that are very tricky, I think, to attach.
One of the questions that was sent in before today was, have the marla at Newhaven started to breed? And happy to report that yes, they have. So a number of the marla out there during the last health check had pouch young. Marla seem to breed opportunistically when conditions are good. So yeah, they're settling in really well. There are now marla throughout that entire stage 1 fenced area. So they're settling in really well. Another question here about dingoes in our feral predator-free areas. Chantelle, my understanding is that up until now, the areas have not been big enough to support a healthy population of dingoes with the social structures that they have and everything. But the larger stage 2 area at Newhaven will be big enough to have dingoes. So that'll be really interesting because that's a native predator, which will in some ways moderate populations of those reintroduced animals. But up till now, we don't have dingoes inside the fenced areas. Okay, another question here. Is it possible to visit AWC sanctuaries? Well, this week, the answer is still no. In ordinary times, we do have small-scale visitor programs at places like Newhaven. So there's basically a campground and some basic facilities. The same thing at Mt Gibson. Mornington in the Kimberley and Charnley are both well set up with campgrounds and also safari tents at Mornington. Unfortunately, Mornington's unlikely to open this year, but we'll keep you posted if it does. You can also visit Bouree under your own steam, and you can do guided walks at Karakamia in the southwest. I may have missed some there, but you can also check on our website where which sanctuaries you're able to visit. So one here from Rod, is AWC looking to purchase further property, and where is the location of greatest need? As part of our response to the bushfires, we're looking at opportunities for property acquisition in southeastern Australia. And in particular, we're trying to find areas where we can do something of benefit for koalas and also for endangered small mammals like the long-nosed potteroo. So we're in the early stages of planning for scoping out properties for that sort of work. So yeah, there are still plans for further acquisitions. Another question here, when is stage 2 at Newhaven slated to start? That'll be within the next couple of years. So we're planning this year. but obviously the logistics of a project of that scale are immense, and things have had to be put on hold a little bit with the coronavirus outbreak. A further question here, which actually I'll just share another image with you. So a question about feral predators outside the fence. And if you're interested in that, I'd recommend you check out our latest edition of Wildlife Matters magazine. For those of you who subscribe to the print copy, it's on its way to you now. But if you just can't wait to get your hands on it, there's actually an online version on our website, and that's live now. So please pick up a copy of Wildlife Matters. If you're not subscribed, you can go onto the website and sign up. If you have any feedback on the format of the webinar, please let us know, or if there's a topic that you'd be really interested to hear about, let us know as well. And I'd just like to let you know as well, for all of these projects, you know, if you're inspired to support anything in particular, I've got a link in the chat at the moment, which allows you to make a donation to support all of this wonderful work. Chantelle, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Joe, and thanks everyone for joining us.
We wish you luck with the future translocations. Please stay in touch. So if anyone has questions that weren't addressed, and I know there are lots of them here, get in touch with us, give us a call, and we'll try and address those questions after today. Next week, we'll be joined by Rich Seaton, an ecologist in North Queensland, and he'll talk about his work as regional ecologist, looking at all of those sanctuaries, and in particular about a research project looking at the red goshawk and trying to track their movements. That's one of Australia's rarest birds of prey. Thank you to everyone who's joined, and thank you for all of your support, because without it, we couldn't do any of this fantastic work. Stay tuned to hear about the phascogales at Newhaven, and until then, I'll see you next week. Thanks very much.